Hello and welcome to a City Voices interview with Sandy Steingard, MD, who is very excited about a treatment modality that I believe started in Finland called open dialogue, and it's a mental health treatment modality. Is it also for substance abuse, or is it just mental health?
Well, most of the research is in treating people with psychiatric conditions. And I think most of the places where it's being applied is primarily with people with mental health conditions. But it's a general approach that can be used in other settings and could be applied in almost any kind of setting, not only mental health settings. It's a way of talking with people and talking with groups of people. So it has pretty broad applicability.
So traditional therapy is a one-to-one thing. You have one therapist and you have one patient, and then they have a discussion. How does open dialogue differ from that?
Well, it takes a network orientation. So for instance, when a person has a problem or calls someone up, the first question would be, who else might be helpful in thinking about this? And it may not be the person at the center of concern who calls. It could be a family member saying, I'm worried about my brother, I'm worried about my son. And from the beginning, it's a network meeting. If people are willing to do that, if people are interested in that. And the idea is that other people may bring different perspectives. And not only that, ideally, it's not a single therapist, so that the therapists also work in teams. And often there's two and sometimes even more who come together. So it's a group gathering.
So we're talking about, let's talk about who's in the room. You have at least two therapists, right? You have,
Yes.
you have the peer. We call patients peers.
Okay.
Okay, so you have the peer who's dealing with who's recovering from a crisis, and you have who else?
Well, it would be who the peer would want to bring in. So that's what, one of the values is respect and hospitality. So that question would be, who do you think would be important? And so it could be a friend, it could be a parent, it could be a sibling. It really would depend on how that first question was answered.
So is the peer the person that is asked like who they want to bring into the meeting?
Yes. Now, it can be, I mean, my own experience, sometimes I will have a parent call and say, I'm worried about my child. And I worked with adults, so it would be an adult child. So that person might call, and then you might say, you might ask that person who's interested in being there. But ultimately, you want to bring the peer in, that voice is respected, and certainly the whole process is a collaborative process, and who that person thinks is important would be a valuable contribution.
So you discovered open dialogue in your travels, right? Can you tell us a little bit about how you discovered it?
Well, I discovered it through Robert Whitaker's writing. So I read Anatomy of an Epidemic in 2011, and in that book, Robert Whitaker's a journalist who's written a few books about psychiatry, and that book a lot was about the paradigm of care that centers psychopharmacology, and he raised some questions about the use of drugs. And at the end of the book, he talked about paradigms of care that weren't as centered on the use of psychotropic drugs, psychoactive drugs. So one of them was open dialogue in Tornio. So that's when I first learned
open dialogue
about it.
In what?
Tornio, Finland is where it was centered. Northern Finland, up near Lapland. And that's when I first heard about it. And then a whole bunch of circumstances came together And I had an opportunity to travel there and meet the people who developed it. And then I also had the opportunity to be trained with Mary Olson at the Institute for Dialogic Practice, which is based in the United States.
So it started in Tornio, Finland, and
Tornio, Finland.
how long ago was that, and how successful has it been in Finland?
Yeah, well, they developed this in the 1980s, roughly, and continued to evolve it into the 90s. And then starting in the 90s, they participated in a study in Finland looking at the outcomes of people who had experienced a first episode of what a psychiatrist would call psychosis, an extreme state, this kind of thing. And they studied the outcomes of those individuals who were getting a forerunner of open dialogue, which is called need adapted treatment. And they studied it in a few different areas in Finland. The people in Tornio went on to develop and evolve this practice and continued to study. And they did a number of studies on it. And what they reported was very, very good outcomes. So at 5 years, only about 20% of people in their group were on disability. Comparing that to a comparable kind of program from Stockholm, Sweden, it was something like 80% were on disability. So much higher rates of good outcomes in terms of functioning, with much, much lower uses of antipsychotic drugs, which are the usual standard treatment. They've now done studies looking at outcomes 20 years down the road, people who had been in these studies and follow-ups, and they're continuing to show ongoing, very, very good outcomes in their group. So that's why people talk about this most with psychosis, but in Tornio, Finland, this is how they run their mental health system. So anybody that calls is given the opportunity for a network meeting.
So let me get this straight. In Finland, with this open dialogue, and you mentioned the predecessor too, with that alternative to traditional therapy has resulted in outcomes such as, let's be very specific, we're talking about reduced medication, what else, employment, what
Yes.
else?
Those are the main outcomes that they've demonstrated. The being employed versus being on disability, and they've also reported on the use of medications. I mean, one thing I want to be clear on is that the research that they have is on people were experiencing a first episode of psychosis. They haven't, to the best of my knowledge, reported on outcomes with other groups. The other thing is, that I want to be clear on, is that open dialogue did not expand throughout Finland. So this is not the way that the whole entire Finnish mental health system is structured. It continues to be what is practiced in Western Lapland. Now, there are places right now around the world that are interested in adapting this, but it did not take over the entire Finnish mental health care system.
Okay, so in Finland, there's still much more of a pharmacological approach, right?
My understanding is that in places like Helsinki, which is, the population center of the country, it's more standard and more typical of what you would find in the United States. So, I mean, and Western Lapland is a very small, sparsely populated part of the country. It's the northern part, and mostly this area, Tornio, is in Western Lapland. Tornio, actually, you can be in Tornio and walk across the street and you're in Sweden. So it's on the border of Finland and Sweden.
Okay. So that's It sounds like a rural area.
Yeah, it's a small city and somewhat rural. Yes. Um, there's reindeer.
Nice. It looks like your
Yeah.
bandwidth is low, it's telling me.
Oh,
Well, that, well, I could still see you and I could still hear you, but
okay.
when the bandwidth is low, there's sometimes like, video issues. I think, which is,
Would
I
you
think, what you're experiencing now.
would you like me to move?
Well, the only solution would be to use another computer that has better bandwidth.
Yeah, I mean, this is like the best computer in the house, but it may be that I'm a little far from my router. And
Oh,
I'm up here because I have two dogs and I just sound in the house and movement. But if this is a problem for you in this recording, I can try to move to another place.
okay. I will pause the recording and we can
Okay.
relocate.
Okay.
So tell us a little bit about your background. You're an MD, and tell us about your practice and stuff like that.
So I'm a psychiatrist. I recently retired from working at a community mental health center in Burlington, Vermont, where I worked for 25 years. Before then, I did some inpatient work in Vermont and Pennsylvania. I did all my training in Boston. My interest in psychiatry has been with people who are experiencing what psychiatrists call psychosis, sometimes given a diagnosis of schizophrenia, sometimes as diagnosis of bipolar disorder. So that's been my interest. Over the years, I became more involved in administration of the clinic, but I always retained a strong clinical practice, working mostly with people with those problems.
Okay, tell me what you have learned from your patients who have experienced psychosis. Have you learned anything from them?
Oh, I've learned a lot. I mean, I could talk for a long time. I mean, over the course of my career in psychiatry, I became increasingly critical of the different paradigms under which psychiatry operated, and critical of the strong emphasis on biological understandings of human distress and biological treatments, drugs. I became very concerned about the pharmaceutical company influence on psychiatry and what we know about psychiatry. That's, in this increasing critical state, I always thought I had respectful relationships with my patients. I hope that I did. I always cared about them. I was very curious about their conditions and wanting to understand it. But I think where I've shifted over the past 10 years is embracing humility and sort of knowing what I don't know, acknowledging what I don't know. I've never had a psychotic experience that I'm aware of. And so I've come to appreciate how that's limiting for me, because it's such a complex and kind of thing. So spending more time, and that's why I like dialogic practice, that you really approach things with a curiosity, and you're slow to put a label on things. And so appreciating the vast heterogeneity of what falls under this umbrella of psychosis, what falls under it is really varies so much. So, needing to spend a lot of time with curiosity and humility and trying to understand the experience. What people have taught me is their remarkable resilience. In the world that we live in, because I'm a doctor, I have all this privilege and a certain amount of respect. And, what I've learned is, I don't know that I would last a day, dealing with some of the things that some of the people that I worked with dealt with, just in so many different levels. And whatever their internal experiences is, whatever the traumas that they've had, and, having to navigate life, dealing with, not being able to hold a job, and poverty, and being forced into hospitals, all the things that can end up happening. I see people surviving and thriving and learning ways to have very rich and meaningful lives that left me feeling just, humble. Humble's the best word I have for it.
You mentioned your, what's the right word? Your feelings, negative feelings toward the influence that Big Pharma has over psychiatry. Can you tell us about the nature of Big Pharma's relations to psychiatry and what made you feel that way?
Well, I mean, the nature of the relationship is, books have been written about this, that, they fund research for drug development, and in funding that, they employ physicians to help conduct the study. But what ended up happening is things like paying physicians, it's not just in psychiatry, it's all of medicine, to be what they called key opinion leaders. So they would give them quite a bit of money to go out there and use their point of privilege to talk about these drugs without necessarily revealing their financial, ties to the drug companies. And they would do things like hire ghostwriters to write up their studies, but put on the name of it very prominent people in the medical community. And I think
were you ever approached by Big Pharma representatives to do some of that work?
Yes, I did one drug talk in 1996 for the drug Zyprexa came out, olanzapine. And at the time, I was very excited about this drug because I had been mostly using the older antipsychotics, drugs like haloperidol, and I knew that they were quite limited. And I was reading, from people that I trusted about these new drugs, and I thought this would be good for people. And when the pharmaceutical rep came to me, I was new to Vermont. I had been at the University of Pittsburgh. I thought he was coming to me because he recognized what a smart person I was. And so, and I did this, and it was awful. I felt dirty afterwards. First of all, I never saw the primary research. He gave me a slide set to use. So I was clearly being a mouthpiece for them. And it didn't, and I went there, and there were other physicians, but there are also moms from NAMI that were there, and they looked at me, and I could see that they were trusting me. They were trusting me, and it didn't feel right. I never did that again. And then a year later, I was prescribing this drug, and I noticed that people were putting on a lot of weight, and no one had talked about this. And I bought a scale, and I learned that, people were putting on 20, 30 pounds within months, more sometimes. And then I observed how the leaders of my profession, fought over this. It would be in different articles. There's a lot of newspapers you get, or pamphlets you get when you're a doctor, that are published by the drug companies. And one group was saying, it happens, it's a problem with schizophrenia, or it's not a problem with this drug, it's a problem with all drugs, or we saw this before. And I knew this wasn't true. I mean, I was seeing it, it was a very obvious thing. And it took about 6 years before it came out. And now everybody knows that these newer antipsychotics cause people to put on weight, and that Zyprexa, olanzapine, is one of the worst. And that was a big turning point for me. And then I began to read a lot more about this, and books started to be published in the early 2000s, and and I was reading them a lot and learning about what these mechanisms were. But I was seeing it. So in my clinic, the drug reps would come and they would invite me to these dinners. They would have this dash and go, you go pick up Chinese food and you can talk to our drug rep. And I saw pretty early on that the quality was terrible. And it was, but it wasn't just people like me that were doing it. It was leaders of academic medicine that were participating. And it was that and reading books about that led me finally to Anatomy of an Epidemic, which raised a whole other set of questions. But this had a profound impact on me. It's very demoralizing, very discouraging.
So let's get back to open dialogue. We have a member of the City Voices board who's she's a family member. Her daughter has experienced extreme states, and she discovered open dialogue. She must have read something, and she brought it to my attention. She was very excited about it, and then when I discovered you were giving a talk for Ida about it, I jumped at the chance to interview you. So open dialogue often involves family members sitting around in a dialogue. You call it dialogic, which is the root of dialogue, right? Dialogue meaning people talking to each other, a number of people. And often it involves family members. How frequent is family member involvement, and how helpful is that to involve family members?
Well, I think this is a really wonderful approach for family members. So how often they're involved, again, depends on what the network agrees upon. So the idea is hospitality and invitation. But, one can say, I think it would be a good idea for you to include your parents. For instance, a lot of the people I work with, there's an adult child living at home, and everybody's affected by this experience. And so including everyone is respectful, but it's not forced upon people. Now, one thing I want to say is that in traditional work, families are included. Psychoeducation was the prominent modality that I was trained in. But the idea is this is still, what's different about that is that's expert driven. So in psychoeducation, just like in more traditional treatment, you go to an expert, the expert does some kind of evaluation, and then the expert says, this is what I think the problem is. If it's a psychiatrist, it may come in the form of a diagnosis, but a psychologist, it may come in the form of a formulation. But the idea is the expert tells you what the problem is, and then based on their idea of the problem, they recommend a treatment. And in psychoeducation, families may be involved, but the idea is, let's say if it's someone who's been diagnosed with schizophrenia, the psychoeducation will be, your child has been diagnosed with schizophrenia, this is what schizophrenia is, this is what we recommend that you do in order to help your child, have the best outcome. Now, in dialogic practice, the first question I told you is who would be helpful to understanding this problem? And then when you're together, the next question is, what's the history of the problem? And you then ask everyone in the room what their idea is on what's the history? Why are we here today? What's your understanding of it? And you make a point of getting all perspectives, and all perspectives are valued. And then the question is, what would be a good use of this time today? And again, you go to everyone in the room. Now, the values for the families is that they know what's going on. So rather than take their kid somewhere and then, maybe talk on the phone or, they're in the room, they're hearing it all. The other thing is that their perspective is respected, as is their child. There may be disagreements. So for instance, a very basic thing, someone's at home and not sleeping. And the person, let's say the child's not sleeping, And the child may, I mean, I'm talking about an adult, but it is a child of these parents. And whatever, they like being up at night, you know, watching TV or playing video games. But the adult parent has to get up in the morning and go to work. And this is really hard. So rather than in sort of traditional care, it could play out with the parent saying to the doctor, he's not sleeping, you need to give him something to sleep. And he may say, John, let's call him, and say, I don't want to sleep, I'm happy with this. In this meeting, everybody gets to talk about what their experience is and what everybody's valued. And hopefully there could be a meeting of the minds of what might be a way to go forward, and one that is respectful of everybody's point of view. One family that I worked with, a person came up with this ideas of rules. I'm going to get it wrong, but it was something like rules for compassionate living. I mean, I thought that was beautiful. And that was the person who would have been identified as, let's say, the patient or the peer. Like, well, this was this person's idea of what we were doing. And I just always love that, because we were able to come up with some agreements about how people who care about each other, who may have different perspectives, can find a way to live together that meets, you know, everybody's needs.
So often there's two therapists in the room with the peer and the family. Sometimes even a physician is there too, isn't that right?
I would be in the room, and I'm a physician.
Oh, there you go. And there's a portion of the meeting where the two therapists have a dialogue with each other, just therapist to therapist, having that in front while everyone else is observing them.
Yes.
That sounds a little weird. How does that work?
Whoops, I'm sorry. Well, it's so reflection is what we call it. And it is a real, I'm glad you brought it up. It's a real key part of what this work is. And it can take different kinds of forms. So in a really basic way, what's really nice is that when you work in this field, you end up talking about people a lot, and they're not in the room. And sometimes that talk may not be as respectful as it should be. You know, it just can be more, I think, a tilt to kind of maybe blaming or labeling people. And in this way of working, you really try to have that conversation about people with them. And it does force you, unless you're a jerk, but most of us are trying to be nice people, to frame it in a way that's more respectful. And so that's one thing. It keeps you being respectful. And it's also very transparent. So if, let's say, as a psychiatrist, I'm thinking about starting a medication. A lot of times with this way of working, rather than just saying, I recommend to you that you take this medication, you offer things in a kind of reflective way, like, I'm wondering. So I might say to my colleague, like, I'm wondering, let's say we talked about not sleeping. So, you know, we were just hearing about the sleep, you know, John's not sleeping, and hearing about, you know, why he prefers this and why it's hard for his mom and dad. And, you know, right now I'm wondering whether, I'm sorry about the dog. I'm wondering whether a medication might be helpful to help John to sleep at night. And my colleague may say, you know, do you really think that's a good idea? Because I'm thinking that maybe we could talk to John about other strategies for being quiet, because I'm worried that maybe the drugs could cause this problem. And we have this back and forth about the pros and cons of drugs in front of them. Now, the nice thing about it is that, you know how psychoanalysis, you lie on a couch and you talk to a wall? I mean, I don't know exactly why that, I think there was it was noticed that people are a little freer. And I think, although this doesn't come from that tradition, there's something about, like, I'm talking to you right now, and if I make a recommendation to you about something in your life, it's put right at you. And you're kind of like put on the spot. When I would talk to my colleague and you say it in this way, like, I'm wondering, you just kind of leave it there and people can take it up or not take it up. And there's something nice about that, particularly when people may be feeling like a lot's being forced on them or pushed on them, like just kind of offering it out there. There's something really nice about it. When we go through the training, we try that and you get that. It is a little weird, and then you learn what the advantages are. The other thing in dialogic practice is about the process of communication. And so the risk, the downsides of the traditional approach is that you take, people tell you stuff about themselves, very intimate, personal things, and you can translate that into a symptom. So let's say someone talks about voices, which are very powerful, personal experiences. And if the conversation goes quickly, which it can in traditional saying, that's what I call an auditory hallucination. And it's your brain playing tricks on you. It's not true. It's clearly bothering you. And I suggest you take this medication that will dampen it. Nothing really wrong with that. But in this way of working, you spend a lot of time just being curious. This is like a big deal to someone. And one of the things that I've learned in my wanderings around about the Hearing Voices Network, which is when people who are voice hearers come together and share this. And I ran a group. I started a group because I couldn't find a voice hearer to do it. And it was a really profound experience because it wasn't agenda driven. It was really just a space for people just to talk about these experiences. And I learned a lot. Like late in my career, I learned a lot about this. And so
what have you learned? What have you learned?
What I'm saying, like how rich it is, how important it is, how this is a big part of a person's life, and that it seems to be more respectful to spend a lot of time just hearing it. This is a relationship that someone has, to understand it, to think about it, to think about where it might come from or what it might be reminded of. For some people, that process can help them to make sense of the voices without needing to rely solely on a drug that basically just dampens them. It doesn't really fix the problem. So this way of working is just, sitting with a lot of curiosity about the experience and being very, very slow to translate it into clinical terms. And I think that people like that. People generally appreciate that. And part of the reflection is to kind of pay attention to the language people use, to just sit with that. There's an idea that kind of reflection, noticing words, noticing body movement, can be healing, can be therapeutic, can help people to find a way out of the situation that they're in.
Well, good for you for running a Hearing Voices group. So open dialogue. Some of the outcomes from Finland is that it reduces the need for medication, right?
Yes.
Now, how often does open dialogue, does the team meet with the family, with the peer, and how do they reduce that medication use?
Well, let me just talk about Finland. So their whole idea was that medications were not essential. So the paradigm that we have in the United States is that let's say we're talking about someone who is hearing voices or may have beliefs that aren't held by the rest of the community that they're in, what a psychiatrist might call a delusional idea. So in the United States, antipsychotic drugs are considered essential. I mean, there's a lot of attention, like where I work, to rehabilitation, housing and work, helping people get work, helping people have social connections. So that can be a part of standard care in the United States. But what I thought for a long, long time is that the drugs were essential, that without them, you're not going to be able to be as helpful in offering these other kinds of supports. That wasn't the belief in Tornio, Finland. They did not think they were essential. So they basically tried to hold off on giving them. So in their outcome studies, in the entire 5-year outcomes, only 30% of people were ever on antipsychotic drugs, and at the 5-year outcome, only 20% were on them. So a lot of the reducing the use of medications came about by just not starting them and seeing if people were able to come through the crisis with this support. Now, in the United States, it's very, very hard for that to happen. If you're a young person and you end up in an emergency room or somewhere, you're going to be offered antipsychotic drugs pretty quickly, because an idea arose as they were doing this work in Tornio, Finland. A parallel idea arose in the United States and probably elsewhere, that you need to start the drugs as soon as possible. And if you delay, the person's going to have a worse outcome. So the direction of care in the United States went in a different direction. Now, in the early 90s, when all this was developing, the academic psychiatrists, I was doing research in this area, were trying to use very low doses of medications, but they were using them. But when the new drugs came in, people forgot about that. They thought they were safer and they didn't need to pay attention to dosing. And so, the drugs are used pretty aggressively. Sorry again about the dogs.
That's okay. We can hear you fine.
Good, good, good. So they distracted me a little bit, but as I said, it's different when it's applied here, because it's very hard to find people with a first episode who've not already been exposed to drugs. So then it really, requires a psychiatrist to work with someone to reduce them. And it's something that I was very involved in, but it's hard for me to say how much that happens elsewhere. Even in places where they're using open dialogue, I'm not sure that people are adhering to the same kinds of principles that they used in terms of psychiatric drugs.
So first episode, psychosis experiences were happening for young, I'm assuming they were, relatively young, went in your 20s and early 30s. And the approach in Finland was to shy away, from that specific city in Finland, to shy away from the drugs. How big a role did open dialogue play in helping helping our peers to survive psychosis and lead productive lives? What other supports were necessary? Tell us all about it.
Well, that's a really good question, and I'm not entirely sure, but I went off on a tangent. You asked, how often do you meet? And how often you meet is based on the needs of the system. So in Tornio, they would meet pretty intensively with people, and even at times, if let's say, we've talked about not sleeping, even seeing if there's someone in the home that could be there to help them through the crisis. And but they might meet every day, they might meet weekly. When I'm doing this, it's a similar kind of thing. And I wasn't only offering it to people with a first episode of psychosis. And in Tornio, they also didn't. When they started need adapted treatment, they were working on getting people out of their psychiatric hospitals. And that's how they kind of came upon this way of working. So they were talking about people who had been already in the system and trying to help them to get out. So it can really vary, but I did, some of the networks that I met with where I think things went really well, we often would meet once a month. But if someone's in a crisis, you may need to do this more often. But as I said, what else did they do? I mean, I actually am not as clear on the other psychosocial treatments that they were offering there. And so I can't really answer that. I've spent a lot of time focusing on trying to learn about open dialogue.
Well, I appreciate that. That's fine. I appreciate your honesty on that that response. So now you're you want to bring open dialogue, and you have brought it to some extent to the United States. But there's as you said, the big pharma is huge here. Psychiatry is like a lot of psychiatrists have sold out to big pharma, and physicians, and all other disciplines also sold out to big pharma, especially in this country. So I would imagine there's a huge resistance in the U.S. to an approach like open dialogue that shies away from medication. Now, tell us about the resistance you encountered.
Well, I mean, I'm very lucky. I, live in Vermont, and there's been a lot of interest in this. We've created our own adaptation of this that we call collaborative network approach, and we've been training a lot of people. There's been a positive response from many psychiatrists who are curious and wanting to do this. I think a lot of psychiatrists aren't pleased with the push to what I would call a production model of psychiatry, where the goal is to see as many people in a day as you can, these 15-minute visits, and you churn people through. And that's come from a lot of economic pressures on the field. And so there's a number of psychiatrists that are eager and wanting to find ways to do this. So I'm lucky. I mean, I think that we've made some decent progress, and there's a lot of support within the state. But Vermont's an unusual place, and I don't know how much it can be applied. I mean, there was a big project in New York City called Parachute New York City, which was a need adapted approach. It's it's within the family of this, and it was a really beautiful project, and they developed teams and they trained people up, and they had peers involved, and it was integrated with intentional peer support. But when it ended, there was no funding to sustain it. And that's really sad.
Yeah.
I mean, to not end on a sad note, I mean, there are these places really around the world that are interested, and I think time will tell. So there's, and one thing about the pandemic that we're in is that we're all getting more comfortable with these kinds of virtual meetings. And we just, at where I worked at Howard Center, my agency, we had started a training in January, and it was supposed to run through June. And we had to halt it because it was 25, 30 people in one big room. And we just started Thursday and Friday last week. We resumed it on Zoom, and it went remarkably well. So I think our facility with these kind of virtual meetings has certain advantages. I had some Zoom meetings before I retired with families, and they were a lot easier to set up. We were all comfortable because people don't have to drive to the clinic. And one of the hardest things about these network meetings is finding a common time when everybody's free. People are busy. And so if you can do a Zoom meeting, even if a sibling who's at work can close the door and take some time and be in the meeting, and that's a lot easier than having to leave the office, drive somewhere. So I think there's a lot churning around right now that's positive, and maybe this will continue to have a life.
You sent me literature that I reviewed about open dialogue, and there's a numbered list of like 7 or 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 items about how to conduct open dialogue. The training seems somewhat complex. How easy is it for people to digest, are you finding?
Well, it's an interesting thing because some of it is very light. You know what I mean? It's like a light touch. And a lot of the training is undoing, particularly for me as like an old psychiatrist. I mean, I didn't realize how much I was interpreting people's behaviors. So it's like sometimes an undoing and giving up old habits. But definitely, you know, some of the naysayers, even people that are sympathetic to it, say it's just not practical because the training takes too much time and no one can afford it. So Psychiatric Services is a leading journal that published a paper on like summarizing all the research. And we do need more research. There's some limitations to the Finland studies, and we do need to see if it can be replicated, but it's going to cost a lot of money. And so some people say, we don't have the resources to study this. So I don't know. I mean, I'm very proud of the work that my colleagues and I did in Vermont, because my personal goal was to make this available to people getting services in the public sector and to keep it as cost effective as possible. And I think we've done that to some extent. And so, you know, if we continue to be successful, maybe we can replicate that. But I don't, you know, time will tell. I mean, I may not really be around enough to see if they're successful, but, or, you know, there's a group, there's a large group that are very passionate about this.
That's good. Sometimes when a thought slips your mind, just being silent for a while and emptying your head, it comes back.
Yeah. Oh, you know, one thing I want to say about what I sent you while you're thinking, is that okay?
Sure.
So I was just trying to get, you know, there's a lot that's been written about open dialogue, and I was just trying to give you something to give you a little flavor of it. And that one paper of the 12 fidelity measures, that was done for the purposes of research, because if you do research, you need to say, how do we know what these people are doing is this thing that we call open dialogue. So it's pretty comprehensive, and you can, I think in a pragmatic way, you can do some things. Like for instance, anyone can start, a therapist can say, who would be important to have in this meeting? I mean, there's no reason why a therapist can't start from time to time, take more of a network approach and periodically bring in other voices. That's not a heavy lift. I mean, it's a heavy lift to have 2 therapists in the room, because no insurers want to pay for more than 1 therapist in the room. So there's some things that are structurally harder to do, but there's other things that are a little easier. People can learn to reflect. Even if you're alone, you might say something like, you know, I might say to the air, you know, I'm wondering if Dan is finding this of interest. Now, if I was with someone, I could say it to that person, and you could choose to respond or not respond, but I can say it to the air, and then you can choose to respond or not. Whereas if I said to you directly, Dan, are you finding this of interest? You'd be on the spot more. But there are ways that you can bring some of this into therapeutic settings and play around with it and see if it's of use.
You can bring some of it, you don't have to bring all of it.
That's what I'm saying. So I think that there are small things that you can do. Like as soon as I did the training, I started every meeting saying, what would be a good use of this time today? And sometimes people had an idea, sometimes not. But before that, it would be more, you know, I tend to start with an open-ended question, like, how are you doing, or this kind of thing. But this way, it starts out with where that person is. What does that person think? And if they say, I don't have any idea, you know, usually I have things that I need to ask in order to do my job as a doctor, but at least I'm starting with what that person wanted. So that's a simple thing to do.
Given the complexities of training and training others in open dialogue, I mean, can open dialogue be simplified? Can it be simplified in a much more digestible fashion?
Yeah, I think this is what we're going to figure out. You know, so a lot of people, this is a big topic of discussion. And like the training that we're doing at my agency is right now 12 days. Now, when I did the training, it was 15 days. So I don't think people know. Like the training in Tornio is pretty extensive, but it's built around the training to become a certified family therapist in Finland. It's not built around what is the minimum that one needs in order to be effective in this way. They needed people to be certified to be family therapists so that they could be operating within the Finnish system. So they created this training. But I don't know that anyone knows what the minimum is. And I think this is a really excellent question. And people are asking this, people are questioning, but even to get the answer to that question takes a certain amount of resources, because then you'd need to do some mini training and then see how that works out and what are the outcomes. Doing outcome studies are very, very expensive. Doing a 5-year outcome study, it's enormously expensive to track people, to follow them, to do the assessments. It's a very hard thing to do.
What about just getting graduate students excited about a possible dissertation on the topic?
Well, I mean, yes, but they still need some resources. I mean, there is a person named Anna Florence, who's a Brazilian psychologist, and she learned about this and was very interested and got herself a fellowship. And she's now at Yale. She's doing a lot of interesting work. And she did some research on the Vermont collaborative network approach. So that was that kind of thing. It helped her. She did her thesis on that. And we collected some outcome data. So that gives us some credibility. So yeah, I think that's a good idea.
All right. Any closing thoughts?
No, thanks for taking the time to talk with me. It's an honor. So I appreciate your time.
And I appreciate yours. Thank you so much for doing this.
Sure. Well, take care. It's nice to meet you, Dan.